Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Uniform Guidance, Developments, and Compliance Strategies. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Amanda McCleary-Moore, partner for our Oregon region.
Hi everyone, I'm super excited to be here with all of you today.
And Erica Forhan, partner and director of Audit and Attest.
Hi there, I am really pleased to see we have so many participants with an interest in this topic today.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda to get us started.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today to talk about uniform guidance and federal awards. A lot of the information that we're providing today is information that we have received from the GAQC, as they're a partner and a great resource for providing information on these topics. So we'll have some references to them throughout this presentation. This year has been very unique, to say the least. So we have incorporated some very relevant, on-point, hot topics for you. We put this presentation together during a pandemic, and we wanted to incorporate discussion of the recent challenges you're likely facing and will affect your next audit. More specifically, implications from COVID-19. We will also cover some technical updates to the uniform guidance, the compliance supplement, at least what we know so far, and the Yellow Book. We are going to kick off the presentation with a polling question. We want to get a feel for the organizational mix and the audience today. If by chance some of these organizations don't quite fit the organization you're calling in from, maybe pick whatever might be the closest type of organization. I'll give you a few moments to respond. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit Submit. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, so get in your answers, and we will see who is here today. Great. It looks like we have a really good mix of different types of organizations here today. I think we're going to hit on information that is going to be relevant to each one of you, some pieces more than others, and so I hope you get a lot out of it today. Here is an overview of how the presentation will flow today in order to cover our objectives. We'll start with the GAO changes to the 2018 Yellow Book and discuss the recent developments. During our discussion of recent developments to the single audit and uniform guidance, we'll spend quite a bit of time covering COVID-19 and the implication it has had on the single audit this year, or will continue to have as single audits occur. We will conclude with other federal agency updates such as the Federal Audit Clearinghouse and data collection form developments. Erica is going to kick us off with the 2018 Yellow Book update.
Thanks, Amanda. So we will jump right in with one of the developments this year that we wanted to bring to your attention. There is a new version of government auditing standards, or the Yellow Book. Now, I know some of you are internal or external auditors, so you are probably well familiar with this, and others of you maybe have heard a lot about the Yellow Book over the years. It is one of the fundamental sets of auditing standards the auditor uses in performing most of your financial statement audits, and definitely the single audit, compliance audit portion of a uniform guidance engagement. And some of you auditors might be required to follow it, so we thought we would just touch on it more from the perspective, though, of what this means for an auditee who has an audit performed in accordance with the Yellow Book. If you're an auditor, you need much more information on this than we are going to provide today, but this is just a little bit of an awareness issue for auditees. We are now in the period of implementation of the 2018 Yellow Book. So your external auditor performing a single audit will be implementing the 2018 revision of the Yellow Book. And it's available to anyone. Links to the Yellow Book are available if you want to download and access it. And I will also point out we have lots of links in our slide deck, and in the PDF you receive of the slides, they should be linkable through that PDF. So you can just click right through those links. So the new version of the Yellow Book supersedes the previous versions from 2011 and incorporates the GAO's 2018 CPE guidance. So it's all now in one little package. In terms of the effective date, the new revision is effective for financial audits for periods ending on or after June 30th, 2020. So that's the year that we're currently in. For performance audits, if any of you have a performance audit performed, it already was effective as of July 1st of 2019. And early implementation is not permitted, so here we are right in that implementation period now. So from a high level, here's a summary of key changes just to refresh your understanding of this or to pique your interest on what some of those were. The one that's listed here in bold is done so intentionally. This looks at the independence requirements, and specifically the main change here relates to performance of non-audit services, especially in the area of preparing accounting records and financial statements. And this perhaps has the biggest effect on auditees in terms of the auditor's independence. The language that was added to the Yellow Book around this is very deliberate and also might increase the documentation requirements from the auditor's perspective. Now, auditors will likely be taking a closer look at this under the 2018 Yellow Book than they ever have before. They'll probably be gathering more information on the auditee's skills, knowledge, and experience, and that's a specific term used in the Yellow Book. So skills, knowledge, and experience, and the capabilities of the auditee personnel to oversee the non-audit services that the auditor performs. The auditor might be asking the auditee to take a more active role in overseeing those non-audit services as well. And those non-audit services are really those things that are sometimes ancillary to a financial statement audit, like assisting in the preparation of financial statements, or even outside of what you would consider kind of the normal financial statement audit service. So there's not necessarily new limits on what an auditor can do outside of the financial statement audit or the single audit. but there are criteria that have to be met before we can proceed. So there's more emphasis on making sure we're getting that right and documenting our evaluation of the circumstances. And then some very late breaking news. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Government Accountability Office, which is the body that maintains government auditing standards, issued an alert on GAO CPE requirements. The requirements for continuing professional education embodied in the Yellow Book or Government Auditing Standards is one of the more unique aspects of that set of rules that auditors need to contend with. So again, we're mentioning it here just in case any of you are in an audit organization and need to comply with the CPE requirements under Yellow Book. The GAO has granted some relief by allowing a grace period for the CPE requirements and waiving the requirements for the minimum 20 hours that was required of CPE to be obtained annually. And then there's also an allowance to carry over CPE from one period to the next. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't make the requirement to obtain the CPE go away entirely. And regardless of the relief provided by the GAO on their CPE requirements, you always need to check your own state board's rules because state licensing requirements may be even more restrictive than the GAO's requirements. And obviously, a change to GAO standards doesn't necessarily translate to a change in the state board's rules. So you want to make sure that you stay compliant with your own state's requirements if you're needing to have CPE CPE hours obtained. Now the good news is today our session is qualified for governmental CPE credits. So you're 1 hour on your way already for those. So with that, we have another polling question. Again, we encourage you to answer the question and then submit your answer. So the question is, which of the following is not considered a non-audit service? So this is a challengingly worded question. So we're looking for what's not a non-audit service. So you've got 4 choices here. You have the auditor assisting in drafting the financial statements for the auditee. You have the auditor completing the auditee section of a data collection form in a single audit. You have an auditor performing an agreed upon procedures engagement related to a state statute. Or you have an auditor providing the auditee assistance in implementing a new accounting standard. Now, that happens often. All of these things happen quite often. So which one of these is not a non-audit service? And it's kind of a tricky question if you haven't had to deal with these quite a bit, because what's a non-audit service? So for example, an agreed upon procedures engagement is not an audit, but is it a non-audit service? So the language can be tricky. So we understand this is a bit of a trick question. So I think we've given you enough time to pick an answer. So we'll go ahead and see what you think. Okay, answers are all across the board here. What is considered a non-audit service? So it's interesting. On answer A, the auditor assisting in drafting the financial statements, I knew this was going to be a trick question. Actually, that is a non-audit service. It usually comes with the auditor's financial statement audit service. The two are sometimes very closely aligned with each other, but it's actually outside the scope of a financial statement audit, and it's a non-audit service. Number B, the auditor certainly does have to complete their section of the data collection form, and that is part of the financial statement audit and the single audit. But the auditor completing the auditee section, that's actually a non-audit service. And let's go to D, the auditor providing an auditee assistance in implementing a new accounting standard. Again, usually you are turning to your auditor for advice in implementing a new standard, but that's actually outside the scope of a financial statement audit. So C, actually, in this case, is the right answer, and the majority of people got that right. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Erica. As we transition to the topic of single audits, we want to take a step back this year and understand the implications of COVID-19, the current challenges, and then the very soon-to-be audit challenges. This is having a significant impact on your organizations right now, and we want to set the stage that this is going to be a big area of focus in the single audit from your auditors as well as from federal agencies. Over the past few months, there have been a significant inflow of federal funds into state and local governments, nonprofits, and for-profit entities. Essentially, every organization has been impacted, and certainly all of you. Although we do have a polling slide on that later, so keep that in mind. There have also been revisions to existing programs' compliance requirements as a result of the increased funding and the acts that authorize the funding. In addition to COVID-19 implications, the President's management agenda continues to impact policy. We're not going to cover this in any detail today, but it's good to know that the President's agenda, in particular the cross-agency priority goal on grants, will have an impact in the future. We've provided links to those items in this presentation, so you should be able to access that when you download the handouts. Here are the key areas that we plan to cover today. COVID-19 implications as it relates to your single audits. So you'll see that there are a number of bullet points there, so that's where we'll probably spend the majority of our time today. We'll touch on the 2020 compliance supplement and what we know so far, and then updates to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. However, before we dive right in, I wanted to highlight that this is an evolving topic. We'll probably say that a number of times today. We don't have all the answers, and all the answers are not out there yet, as we will discuss. We'll do our best to communicate what we know, and then at the end of the presentation, we're going to provide some links to various sources, resources, and groups to get you more information, such as NACUBO, the Council of Governmental Relations, Department of Treasury, the GAQC, and the AICPA. There's actually quite a few links throughout this entire presentation, so if it's underlined and bolded, as Eric had mentioned previously, you should be able to open up the source document from that through your handouts. Okay. So let's start by recapping the acts that resulted in providing you with all of this additional federal funding and has likely created some significant inflows for most of you. This first act was issued in early March, and it was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. Not easy to say, which was about $8.3 billion act. And it was meant to respond to the outbreak and provide appropriations to the Department of Health and Human Services, the State Department, and the Small Business Administration to respond to the coronavirus for items such as developing vaccines, procuring medical supplies, providing grants for state, local, and tribal public health agencies and organizations, and also loans for small businesses. The next act was issued in mid-March, and that was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was a $3 million act specifically designated for the domestic needs of the outbreak, such as paid sick leave, insurance coverage, and employment benefits. And then the last act was the big one. This one was issued at the end of March and was the CARES Act, and it was a $2 trillion act. This one impacted not-for-profits, state and local governments, healthcare entities, and many other entities. The CARES Act was to provide economic assistance for American workers and families, small businesses, and preserve jobs for American industries in a very quick manner. Because it did all happen so quickly, you've likely received funding that resulted in many questions about how to spend it or what the compliance requirements are, if any. There likely could be more acts to come. We just don't know what that might look like or how it may impact your organizations, so definitely stay tuned in anything COVID related. So given that a lot of you on this call likely have a fiscal year end of June 30, the timing of all of this is going to introduce some challenges to your upcoming single audits. A lot of questions have been generated in the profession, specifically related to the federal programs in the single audit. A lot of these questions have been sent to the GAQC, and they actually put together a letter and sent it in to the OMB. There's a link provided so you can actually look at that letter and the questions that were submitted. I don't believe that there has been a response to this letter at this time, but keeping up to date on GAQC alerts is a really good way to stay in the loop on any of those matters. Some of the questions that were included in that letter and that we hope are answered include, what of the new money and programs will be subject to uniform guidance, not just the audit requirement, but the cost principles and other compliance requirements. You're likely already receiving or received some of these awards and administering them to the best of your abilities with the guidance that you do have. Other questions would include, have CFDA numbers been created? Will there be new CFDA numbers? Will it change how you identify clusters? And then a big one is really, will the compliance supplement recognize any sort of agency changes? This is a lot of new funding. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see that there are some exceptions or flexibility given within those compliance requirements. And is the compliance supplement going to handle those changes? And if not, how are you going to work with your auditors to make sure that the right compliance areas are getting audited? So a lot of questions surrounding that funding. So this slide includes funding that at this point has the least amount of certainty. So this is probably an area where you have more questions. Very little to no guidance has been provided yet. So if you've received some of this funding, we understand that there is confusion and likely some frustration with these types of funds. So we have 4 listed here on this slide. Of these 4, the 2 largest pots of money awarded included the first one on the list, the Department of Treasury's Coronavirus Relief Fund to state and local governments, and that was for $150 billion. The other really large one is actually at the bottom of the slide, the Provider Relief Funding from the Public Health and Social Services Emergency Fund, and that was for $100 billion. The big questions are whether these are subject to audit. Are they scoped in or out of compliance with uniform guidance? Should it be included on your CFA? That is all unknown at this point, unfortunately, and those are big pots of money. So with June 30 just around the corner, we hope that you get the answers and that we have answers for these types of questions very soon, as it's going to become very relevant very quickly. The other 2 on the slide also have uncertainty, so there hasn't been guidance provided for those as well. Those amounts of money are just less, but it's still important to get it right, to make sure that you're complying with the compliance requirements if there are any, and that you're including it on your CFA if it's scoped in. And because, as I mentioned, collectively, this is over $250 billion. The amounts are large, and you're probably receiving large amounts. So it's going to affect your CFA in a big way, which could impact establishing your Type A programs and what is tested by your auditor and what that looks like, including future audits, as those types of items do change how programs get selected. So we're not here today just to remind you or let you know about all the questions that are out there around this funding. Over the next few slides, we're going to cover areas that do have more clarity and where guidance has been given so you know where to get your specific answers. So let's switch to some funding where there is more clarity, such as the Education Stabilization Fund from the Department of Education. If you go to the website for the Department of Education, which we have hyperlinked here for you, you will see that this funding is fully described and has all been assigned CFDA numbers, which you can see on the slide there. So some good news, some of this funding has some very good guidance on it. All of this funding on this slide are for K through 12 and higher education and are subject to audit and in scope for uniform guidance. The funding documents and certificate agreements clearly state uniform guidance is applicable and subject to the single audit requirement. FAQs are still being issued, and there is still some clarity needed for these types of funds, but there's a lot more clarity for these programs than the programs on the previous slide. If you want to see an example of the funding and certificate agreements, we have actually linked in an example here, but we're not going to specifically go over that today. So there's a lot more to come out of these slides when you have the handouts and links to all of these items to provide you with more clarity and guidance. So let's talk about the Small Business Administration, or SBA loans. Specifically, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or what we refer to as the EIDL, and then the Paycheck Protection Program Loan, which is the PPP loan. We won't spend a lot of time on this as we realize it's not applicable to some state and local governments, but for some of the entities here today, this is a hot topic. One of the biggest questions that we've heard from our clients is whether the issuance of these loans are subject to uniform guidance, specifically within the not-for-profit sector, although others are impacted as well. Luckily, in this case, the SBA has provided some answers, and they are different for the two types of loans. The SBA concluded that the PPP loans are not subject to single audit. These loans were made through a bank to a not-for-profit or a for-profit entity. However, the other loan under the EIDL program are received from the SBA and are considered direct loans and considered federal financial assistance. These should be put on your CFA and are subject to audit. So some good news here in the fact that at least there's some clarity and that the PPP loan is not subject to the single audit guidance. So some good news. I do want to point out one small caveat here. You'll see the warning on the slide. While it has been communicated to the GAQC from the SBA, it has not been provided in writing yet. So I wouldn't celebrate just quite yet until we have that communicated in writing, but it has been communicated, and it seems that this is going to be the way that it concludes. But I would continue to monitor that until there is some documented conclusions. I'm going to switch over from issues with new money to issues with old money or existing programs. The current environment that we are living in has created some challenges on existing programs as well. So this isn't just the new money you might be receiving. Some existing programs, such as Student Financial Aid Program from the Department of Education, have had to be more flexible as organizations try to comply with the compliance requirements, but they are given some flexibility given this current environment, as there may be such things as limited personnel resources or challenges with technology working in a remote environment. So some flexibility has had to be given there. Guidance has been provided by the Department of Education on student financial aid, and we have included the links on this slide. There's been updates as recent as last Friday, and I have links to all of those here for you. So if you do have the Student Financial Aid Program, it's worth going out there to read through what flexibility you might have been given. The Student Financial Aid Program is just one example of a program with some added flexibility and compliance. There are many other programs with some added flexibility or have compliance exceptions. We hope that these added changes are going to be addressed in the compliance supplement. It would be helpful both to the auditee and the auditor, specifically so that the auditors know what to test. This is very important because if the compliance requirements were lifted in order for you to be able to use the money easier or added that flexibility, the auditors will need to be aware of that too, so they know what to audit. What we don't want to see is auditees receiving findings over areas where they were provided exception but don't have that clearly documented and it's not addressed in the compliance supplement. So we're really hoping that it does, but given the timing and the environment that we're in, we just don't know. So while determining whether some of the funding is in scope for audit and subject to uniform guidance, there are also some just more administrative or operational challenges that you're going to have to deal with in this next audit cycle, I'm sure, or even in this, if you're looking at interim work. At this point in time, the audit's going to be performed remotely due to shutdowns either the auditor location or the auditee location or both locations. How is that going to impact your timing? How will that work operationally? Given the challenges, how do you maintain efficiency for both parties? I know for my clients, I don't want to be more disruptive in an environment where there is a lot of disruption already. So how do you work through those nuances? And we've talked about the uncertainty and much of the new funding, and hopefully that will all get resolved. And you'll just need to kind of think through how that might affect your major program determination. I kind of touched on that already, but it likely could have a significant impact on your Type A and Type B thresholds, so different programs will be audited than maybe you've seen in the past. Another consideration is your internal controls. Have your internal controls changed since COVID-19? Will more than one control be applicable to a certain compliance requirement, maybe before and after COVID? How did you incorporate your internal controls to maintain that they stay effective? If so, that could result in additional testing by the auditor. You might need to get comfortable with the controls before COVID-19 and after, when you're working in maybe more of a remote environment. So just something to be aware of and to prepare for is that your audit really could look a little bit different this year, and any changes in your internal controls really should be documented and clear, and make sure that you have that prepared for your auditor. So some other guidance that has been given. The OMB has provided a few memos to the federal agencies to allow them to provide this flexibility that I've been mentioning in compliance to their recipients and subrecipients. We provided a link to all the memos I will be discussing. The first memo is M-20-11, and it's specifically related to funding from early March, the $9 billion in emergency supplemental appropriations for coronavirus preparation and response. These funds flowed mostly through HHS and provided flexibility such as a potential 12-month single audit submission extension to the recipients that specifically received that funding under that act. When this memo first came out, it did provide some confusion, as it was directed at the federal agency and does not provide a blanket waiver of 12 months. So that's a key piece on this slide, is that it's not a blanket waiver. The extensions under this memo are very limited and very specific. The federal awarding agency's actions need to provide implementing guidance for provisions in this memo in order to take effect on specific awards. The next memo that the OMB released was M-20-17, Administrative Relief for Recipients and Applicants of Federal Financial Assistance directly impacted by the coronavirus, COVID-19, due to loss of operations. This one was provided to federal awarding agencies, letting them know that they can provide flexibility. What's different about this one is it's not only related specifically to that first act and that specific funding. This is related to anyone that that was directly impacted due to COVID-19 and a loss of operations. The memo provides administrative relief to an expanded scope of recipients affected by the loss of operational capacity and increased costs as a result of COVID-19. In the memo, there were 13 administrative relief exceptions, such as flexibility with SAM registration, flexibility with application deadlines, and exemption of certain procurement requirements, just to name a few. What is different from the other memo that I mentioned is that it provides a blanket 6-month single audit extension beyond the normal due date from year end from the date of the memo, which was March 19th, through the June 30, 2020 year ends. These extensions are provided, as I mentioned, as a blanket extension. So essentially, all entities have this extension, and it will not impact your low-risk auditee. So if you do use this extension, document it and just be aware that it's not going to impact that low-risk auditee. No agency action is actually needed for this extension to apply. Recipients and subrecipients do not need to seek approval. However, there is a requirement for recipients to maintain the documentation on file that includes the reasons for the delayed filing and support the recipient was affected by the loss of operational capacity and increased costs as a result of COVID-19. Federal awarding agency actions need to provide implementing guidance for the provisions in this memo to take effect for specific awards, except for the audit extension. We'll go over some examples on the next slide. One other thing to note here is that the OMB is going to reassess these memos in 90 days, which they were put out there in March. So in June, they're going to reassess these. So just make sure that you're monitoring for those, especially if you've been provided any of these exceptions. As I mentioned, here are some examples of how agencies adopted M-20-17. Some adopted agency-wide and others by department or branches, and even some were just by topic. As you can see, 2 departments of HHS adopted the entire memo and provided the implementing guidance, while the Department of Ed only adopted 2 of the 13 topics. This is just a snapshot of some federal agencies. So if you're wondering which agencies have adopted any or all of the memo and provided that implementing guidance, a good way to look that up is just a Google search of federal agency adoption of OMB memo M-20-17 to find agency actions. Two other memos worth mentioning, but keep in mind are directed at the federal award agencies, is M-20-20. It provides a class exception that allows federal award agencies to repurpose existing federal financial assistance programs and awards to support the emergency response to COVID-19. And then the second memo is M-20-21, implementation guidance for supplemental funding provided in response to COVID-19. This memo is directed at agencies to leverage and continue to employ existing financial transparency and accountability mechanisms wherever possible. In balancing the speed with transparency, agencies are to consider the 3 core principles: mission achievement, expediency, transparency, and accountability. And with that, we have another polling question that I hinted at earlier. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you anticipate that the COVID pandemic will impact your upcoming uniform guidance audit? 1, not at all. 2, only slightly. 3, somewhat. 4, very significantly. Or 5, not sure yet.
For those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast.
You know, Amanda, while people are answering this question, I thought I might just jump in with one of the questions that came up. And someone asked about the loan forgiveness side of a PPP loan. So, you know, there's one question about whether the granting of the loan is subject to single audit. You've addressed that. As far as we know, it is not. The second piece of that is, well, what if it's forgiven? Does that trigger single audit? And as far as we know, all aspects of the PPP loans are determined to be not subject to single audit. So that's as far as we know, both the granting of it and the forgiveness of it. So again, as Amanda said, we're still waiting to see that officially in writing, but that is the word that's going around.
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to go ahead and close the slide, or close the poll. Gosh, kind of a bell curve there. So it sounds like most likely you'll be impacted somewhat. I mean, it seems like at the very least some of the operational challenges might be there, but it's good to know that there is some out there that are not feeling that's going to have an impact at all. Those are the lucky few. But yeah, at this point it is really hard to say. So interesting feedback there.
Amanda and Erica, what advice do you have for auditees receiving COVID-19 funding, as well as for auditors that want to begin planning and performing interim work?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that, at least from the auditee's perspective, I'll tackle that, and I think Erica will tackle the auditor perspective. From the auditee perspective, I think just having, documenting the funding that you've received and determining if you have any questions about whether it is in scope or out of scope for uniform guidance, and having that discussion with your auditor, making sure that you're on the same page. I would also say be prepared to talk about internal controls. That's going to be very important, very key, and how they were impacted as a result of COVID-19 and potential working from home. If you've received any exceptions or flexibility and compliance requirements, I would make sure that you're documenting that. So we talked a lot about already some of the memos that are out there, some departments that have provided this additional compliance requirement. My advice is to download that, save it, keep a copy, and make sure that you have that documented, especially if you're making some sort of decision off of that. And you'll want to provide that to your auditors. The other thing I kind of wanted to mention is, I think in this environment, we all are going to have to be a little more flexible. You got to add some flexibility into the audit. We're all in this together, and we know that, some concessions might need to be made on either side in form of getting this work done. And then I think my last note might be, really stay up to date on the latest news on COVID-19 related to issuances and extensions. At the end of the slide today, or the slide deck today, we have a number of resources that we're going to provide you with, and so just making sure that you stay up to date on any sort of changes, I think, would be really important. Really just concluding with, regular and consistent communication, making sure that you have things documented, you're talking to your auditor, and I would say the earlier the better.
Yeah, that is great. Communication, I think, is my number one advice too. I guess one more thing for the auditees is, with all the changes in the funding and the stream of funding you might be getting and the rules kind of changing or evolving, one advice is maybe to assign a point person who's responsible for tracking the guidance, monitoring the guidance as it comes out from Treasury and the federal agencies that you're involved with. And we know there's going to be different iterations of that as questions are answered and things evolve. So having one person kind of centrally assigned to monitor that might be helpful. From an auditor perspective, and this crosses over into the auditee as well, but one of my concerns is just the completeness of the CFA, especially in a more decentralized organization. You might not know what funding you're receiving. So that's one of the risk areas, and it's usually better to default to assuming it's going to be on the CFA, assuming it's going to be part of the single audit until you know otherwise. And then once we figure it out, we can back out from that decision before you're issuing your CFA. But at least if you're planning for it, you're gathering the potential items for your CFA, that's going to help a bit. Before we move on, and we have quite a bit more to cover, we're just going to see what we can do in the next 15 minutes or so. But one question that came in was around procurement and exceptions. And I have to say that's the number one question we've gotten is, what kind of leeway do we have with procurement? Are there new rules or exceptions? And that is one of the most frustrating things, because different federal agencies are taking action on that, but it's not across the board. It's you have to look for that program, look at that agency to see what kind of exceptions they've allowed, and some have, but that's kind of the number one thing that I know the GAQC has taken back to OMB, to have a little bit more of a centralized response or comprehensive response to that question, because you're getting all this money, you don't know what you can spend that on, and you don't want to spend it against the rules, but you don't know what the rules are. So unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that. It is one of the biggest frustration, but again, our advice is stay on top of it, keep looking, keep talking with your auditor for any kind of knowledge we can gain collectively on that. Okay, we will move forward then into what I call the normal single audit world. You know, and one of the things that we normally discuss this time of year is the OMB compliance supplement. When will it be out? What will be included? What kinds of changes can we look for? And for any of you who are not familiar with the compliance supplement, it is a critical piece of the auditor's planning for the scope of the single audit. It indicates what procedures we should perform, where we should focus our effort on different programs. It gives some more insight into what the federal agencies are thinking are points of emphasis for the single audit. And the big question this year, this time of year, is what are the changes that's going to be included? With the recent flurry of new awards related to COVID-19 and the uncertainty, you know, what's even going to be covered in the single audit? So we have a few slides here to cover what we know as of now. We have the benefit of some sneak peeks into some of the programs as they're being drafted, so that we can share that with you. But to answer the first question, first of all, the compliance supplement is not out yet. We do know that the OMB's current thinking is to issue a compliance supplement in two parts. The first part would be sort of the guts of the compliance supplement, almost as if COVID-19 and the pandemic never happened. And they're predicting that at least they're predicting that in June of this year. And then they plan to issue an addendum to the extent it's considered necessary that addresses some additional COVID-19 considerations. And that addendum they're anticipating would come out in September of this year. I know already that the Department of Education has identified some things very specifically it would want to have in an update related to some of their programs. I suspect other agencies will discover that over the next few weeks. You know, just keep in mind, everything is moving quite quickly. It's amazing how the agencies have kind of marshaled their forces to push all this funding out, and they kind of had to do it before any rules were written. And that's normally not how it's worked. They normally have worked out all the rules before the funding flows. But it's opposite, and we're sort of seeing the outcome of that right now. So as I said, the GAQC did get a sneak peek, and they submitted several comments on the draft. There are just some inconsistencies that are seen in there, some reporting requirements, especially related to programmatic reports around the effectiveness of a program that the auditor is supposed to audit, but we're not provided with any criteria, and it ends up looking like we'd have to make a subjective evaluation of the program and determine whether the auditee complied with the requirement or not. So it's a little bit fuzzy what the auditor would do, and potentially leads to some inconsistencies. And, you know, auditors like consistency. We like to know what are the rules we're auditing against. You like to know what are the rules you're supposed to comply with. And when those are not very clear in the compliance supplement, it can lead to some confusion and inefficiency and inconsistency. So some of the comments were aimed at resolving some of those things. So what we do know is there's a number of new programs. Those are listed on the left-hand side of the screen. And then there are some existing programs that have had some developments and additional guidance. First and foremost, Medicaid. It's been a lot of years since CMS took a complete look at Medicaid. Well, this year they did. So we're seeing some significant changes in the 2020 compliance supplement in Part 4 for that Medicaid program. Eligibility is an area with quite a bit of change. And there's a new section on refunding the federal share of Medicaid overpayments to providers, and that's a new element to the compliance supplement. The Children's Health Insurance Program, similar to Medicaid, the Department of Health and Human Services is relooking at that program and has made a number of updates and refreshing changes there. For those of you who receive or audit funds under the Head Start program, the main change there is that now the procurement compliance requirement has been identified as being subject to audit. In the past, even if there were material procurements under that program, they were not identified as being subject to audit in the compliance audit. And well, now they are identified as being subject to audit. So that may change the scope of an audit and the types of information the auditee has to provide during the audit. And then finally, there's a part 3.1 of the compliance supplement contains the compliance requirements under the old rules, pre-uniform guidance, so reaching way back to before 2015, and that's been removed, but we expect there will be some instructions given to auditors as to how to deal with those, some of those older programs. And then with respect to Student Financial Assistance Program, there has been some proposed changes there. I know many of our participants indicated they're associated with a higher education institution, so we will spend some time here. You might recall that last year the Department of Education had new requirements for auditors to communicate information about our sampling when we do use sampling, and to indicate how that related to some of our findings. And we were required to send that to the Department of Education to a secure email address, and those requirements will continue into 2020. But we understand that more information will be provided or will be required to be reported in that format, specifically the OPE ID numbers. And those typically equate to a campus site. And it's really interesting that the Department of Education is requesting this, because we typically don't sample campus by campus for a school that has more than one campus. So we're still going to be asked to spread our sample information down to that level. So that could be a difficult challenge for the auditor to comply with that requirement. But we'll see what the Department of Education thought about the feedback that was provided when the final compliance supplement comes out, and just exactly what that requirement ends up being. For those of you who do this testing, you know there's a fair amount of testing we do for enrollment reporting, and some of the features that we look for in that testing will be expanded. There's also a new proposed special reporting testing related to contractual agreements with third-party services or financial institutions, and this is pretty unique, and we're eager to see how that turns out in the final supplement. And then finally, with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act suggested audit procedures, those are relatively new over the last couple of years, and those will be carried forward with no change expected there. In terms of procurement under the compliance supplement, you might remember that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion around procurement and the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, of 2018. And we were looking for the definition of micro-purchase threshold to be changed in the FAR. It still has not been updated. There's a FAR case number, 2018-004, that's still making its way through the process. No idea of the timeline of that, but you'll see in a moment the uniform guidance is proposed to be revised to decouple the reliance on the FAR for the micro-purchase threshold. But Appendix 7 will continue to have the language saying that auditors are not to report findings if an entity is using the increased thresholds and they've updated their written procedure. So that will continue just like it was in 2019. And then also carried over from 2018 is Part 6 of the Compliance Supplement. And we mention it here because it has to do with internal control. Amanda mentioned earlier about the importance of internal control and tracking how much they've changed in this new environment. And we just want to remind you that Part 6 was refreshed in the 2019 Compliance Supplement and will be carried forward to 2020. It's a great tool for both auditors and auditees. It includes a background discussion on internal controls and the uniform guidance requirements around those. And I like that, you know, there is this refreshed discussion of internal controls. It describes the difference between a process and a control, and, you know, auditees and auditors are always looking for the control. What is designed well enough to detect or prevent non-compliance? So this Part 6 discussion gives some people a new way of thinking about it. It separates it into entity-wide controls that could have an influence over all major programs, all compliance requirements, so they're more broad-based. And it describes how an auditor might be able to leverage some of those controls for to determine their effectiveness across the organization, rather than looking at controls requirement by requirement, program by program. And the appendices do have illustrations of controls. That's not the be-all and end-all. It's not a checklist, but it does give you some ideas maybe to spur on your thinking around internal control. So that brings us to our next polling question, related to that Part 6. It's a quick poll, but have you read through the new Part 6 for ideas for your organization's internal control? Just a quick yes, no, and I don't plan to, or no, but it sounds like a good idea. One of the big takeaways for our audit teams last year is that by distinguishing between the entity level controls and the specific controls, it kind of gave permission to our team members not to document the same control over and over and over and over again for each compliance requirement. We're able to say, hey, this operates over all of these different specified areas. It was probably implied before, but it's a little more explicit under the new Part 6, which is really helpful. So let's see what you all said. Great, I like that answer. I guess maybe I was convincing enough to have you dive into Part 6. So I do think it's a really great tool and hope you benefit from it. So I mentioned there are some proposed revisions of the uniform guidance. This is one development that sure seemed very important before the pandemic and remote working environment came to the fore, but it was a development that came out earlier this year, and there are some proposed revisions to the uniform guidance, and many of us reviewed the proposal, as did the Government Audit Quality Center, and submitted comments to OMB on those revisions. I would say my impression is it didn't quite go far enough. It doesn't accomplish a lot of the things that auditors wanted to see, and I'm sure it doesn't accomplish a lot of things auditees wanted to see. We're not expecting these revisions to have an impact on this year's audit, and actually the effective date is still a little bit up in the air. But just to give you some food for thought and what to look forward to, there are some revisions to some definitions like internal controls. We're a little concerned about some of those definition changes and how they play with other regulations we see. There are those procurement revisions that are proposed, most specifically around the simplified acquisition threshold and the micro-purchase threshold, to make it a little more contained within the uniform guidance itself. With respect to indirect cost rates, there are several elements related to that, some clarifications that if you use the de minimis rate, you do not have to prove you have support for it. There's no documentation required if you're using that rate. There's also a new requirement proposed that all rate agreements from non-federal entities would be made publicly available on an OMB designated federal website. So I know a lot of organizations are not too happy about that. I understand the premise of why to do that, but there's a lot of concern about that. Probably one of the more significant remaining items to cover is the data collection form and Federal Audit Clearinghouse development. There was a new data collection form issued in June of last year. So some of you with June year ends probably have already used it. Some of you just with December 31st, 2019 audits might be using it for the first time. But we do have some lessons learned from this. There are some new features in the form that can be helpful, but some people have had trouble with the form accessing it. One of the tips that the Federal Audit Clearinghouse gave to us was that you could use a non-Chrome or non-Google Chrome browser to access it, and people have more success if they're not using a Google Chrome browser. So a little tip there. Another important element is we're noticing that the Federal Audit Clearinghouse staff are reviewing corrective action plans in detail. And this is new. We weren't aware they were doing much of this before, but they're really looking at whether they can contain all of the elements required under uniform guidance. So that's an area to pay attention to this year. And then also some late breaking news. We talked about the extensions of the single audit reporting deadline, and the Federal Audit Clearinghouse included a notice on their website around documentation of the reason for the delay in filing. If an auditee wants to take advantage of the audit extension, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse is requesting, and they say the word requesting, not requiring, requesting that the documentation of the facts and circumstances around the extension be included in the single audit reporting package. Now, we don't have any guidance in terms of what that should look like, what it should contain, anything like that. So stay on the lookout for that. But we do anticipate it would be an auditee provided document, would not be something that the auditor would provide. So work with your auditor as those things develop for some advice on that. Then real quickly at the end for our higher education folks transitioning out of uniform guidance, really quickly in the area of the Department of Education's financial responsibility standards, there's a new requirement that apply to private nonprofit organizations that participate in the Student Financial Assistance Program. These new rules are going to require some supplementary schedules in the audited financial statements. And to the extent that those numbers in the supplemental schedule don't obviously connect back to the primary financial statements, footnotes have to help with making that linkage back. And the implication for the auditee-auditor relationship is that the auditor would have to provide an in relation to opinion on that supplemental schedule. So that's something to think about when you're engaging your auditor, that scope of the audit needs to be added into the engagement letter. And what's interesting about this is kind of the red alert for some of you, is that this impacts audits when those audits are to be submitted to Easy Audit, and those of you who do this know what that means. When they're submitted to Easy Audit for submissions on or after July 1st, 2020, and that is regardless of the year end. So that affects some of the audits that are underway right now. So be aware of this and follow up if it affects you. And then finally, just another little add-on for certain extensions that are available. These are mostly the for-profit entities receiving some of these funds. There's some links on the pages for some areas where extensions have been granted. So just encourage you to follow up on those links and if any of that applies to you. Okay, that was a quick run through of news, and Amanda, back to you.
Thanks, Erica. I think we're out of time, so I will just kind of highlight that when you download the slides, there's a number of resources that we've included in here where you can sign up for alerts and continue to get more information as we progress through this unprecedented time. And I will leave it here. You can, Moss Adams has some resources as well. We have newsletters, articles. You can connect with us and subscribe to specific content.
All right. Thank you, Amanda and Erica, for a great presentation today. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but if you submitted a question that we did not get to, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast, or you may reach out to our presenters directly. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time.